Thank you for your invitation to participate in this seminar, where the text of St. Francis gives us an opportunity to return to reflect on fundamental issues. I like to present on this occasion the reflection of Elena Pulcini. Therefore, in a preliminary way, the philosophical scope, the method, and the purposes of the investigation of Elena Pulcini, an Italian actress. For those of you who don't know her, she was born in 1950, and she died of COVID in 2010. She was a professor of social philosophy in Florence, and her essays, many of which also translated into English, French, and German and Spanish, have had echoes and resonances even beyond national borders, arousing interest and debate. As we will see for the topics covered, Elena Pulcini is a thought of full harmony with the problems of our own time. On the one hand, Pulcini has drawn up an original historiographical diagnosis of political philosophical modernity, a genealogy of modernity from Hobbes to Franco Fortesi, which we will talk about. On the other hand, he also took note of the requests of Anna Haren, of Gunther Anders, and not least of Hans Jonas, and proposed a philosophy of urgency. The occasion and the urgency are made up of three elements in particular. Firstly, the process of globalization, which have lights and shadows of these processes in which we all live in a global age. Globalization can be a chance. It has had many positive aspects, but globalization has also been a standardizing homologation process based on strong financial powers, no longer governed by states. Financial powers that are geared only to profit and that go beyond any ethical concerns for the disadvantaged and those who remain on the margins of globalization. We will explore these themes further in our discussion today. Secondly, Pulcini was rightly concerned about the resurgence of identity nationalism in Europe. Consider the cases of Russia and Hungary. These nationalisms tend to exclude those who are different, the foreigner, and promote the ideologies of identity boundaries which manifest in violence that can become belligerent. Globalization, on the one hand, fosters a kind of narcissistic and solipsistic individualism, and on the other hand, leads to what Pulcini, in clear terms, defines as endogamous communitarism. Additionally, Pulcini was deeply concerned about the global threat of the ecological crisis. This crisis should prompt us to mobilize not only theoretically, but also in non-academic and properly political ways. It is no coincidence that at some point in her career, Pulcini decided to take action herself, running in the 2019 European elections. Unfortunately, she was unable to follow through due to the onset of COVID-19 and ultimately her death. As a result, she was unable to address these issues in the European Parliament. The ethics of care in Pulcini's work extend to the care of others and the ultimate otherness, that is nature, the Umwelt, the world in which we live. In 2019, Pulcini published a profoundly insightful book that, in my opinion, demonstrated a broad sensitivity. The Care of the World, a text that truly encapsulates her thoughts, discusses fear and responsibility in the global age. This work, also translated into English as Care of the World and Responsibility in the Global Age, argues that caring for the world is necessary to uphold human rights. The care of the world is a fundamental expression of intergenerational justice, representing our duty to future generations. But let's step back and highlight the philosophical scope of Pulcini's research. First of all, social philosophy. For Elena Pulcini, social philosophy has its own epistemological framework and cannot be simply identified with political philosophy. Pulcini then revisits and refines the distinction made by Axel Honneth, a prominent third-generation Frankfurt School scholar and student of Habermas. Honneth distinguishes between political philosophy and social philosophy. Political philosophy has an eminently normative character. Consider John Rawls and political philosophy as practiced in the United States, for example. The central theme of these political philosophies in the state and its legal and institutional structures, the way they ought to be, is that normative aspect. In contrast, social philosophy is a broad critical investigation of social phenomena and also delves into the dimensions of the private, a kind of microphysics of power. According to Elena Pulcini, social philosophy also needs to have its own unique and original normative dimension, a normative dimension that is not based on procedures or institutional mechanisms. Think of Rawls' normatism, his theory of justice, which is a top-down approach from institutions to citizens. For Elena Pulcini, it is necessary to think differently. From the social conflicts that we individuals experience, we need to rethink the foundational moment. Social philosophy must then be based on empirical diagnosis. It analyzes the concrete life of individuals and the associated forms of concrete life. It is not based on prescriptive norms, but on intrinsic potentialities, including emotional and passionate ones. The theme of passions is central to this vision, highlighting the emotional and motivational forces of individuals in their singularity and uniqueness. This is another Franciscan trait of Puccini's work, the attention to the unique singularity of each person and their associated life moments. Social philosophy is then called to express, in Puccini's words, a heretical normativism. This view, which begins with a tendency to be normative, but is heretical in its approach, is very much appreciated. It identifies the ideal Solon by not starting from an abstract, decontextualized historical idea such as John Rawls' concept of justice, which not coincidentally has Platonic and Kantian traits. Rawls himself acknowledges this, stating, "I am a Kantian," aligning himself with Kantian constructivism. However, the social philosophy practiced by Puccini starts from the concrete, from the conflicts found in the social sphere. In this sense, Elena Pulcini is fully, in my opinion, part of the Italian theory paradigm, elaborated, as is well known, by Roberto Esposito. More than that, I would say Pulcini represents a rare feminine expression in this context, perhaps alongside Adriana Cavallero and Angela Lisbello, and a few others. This approach is a typical Italian way to philosophy, referring back to the civil humanism of the 15th century, with figures like Lucio Salutati. It emphasizes life in its elements, particularly its agonistic, conflicting elements, as the principal object of philosophical investigation. In this context of Italian thought or Italian theory, even the most metaphysical authors, classical figures like Pico, Gioberti, and Rosmini, never forget their engagement, and their metaphysics is always a civil metaphysics aimed at regenerating social and political life. Thus, Elena Puccini seems to be a proponent of philosophical resurgence based on the great theme of care that permeates all her work. The overarching theme of her entire work is the passion for care, an ethic of care with four fundamental dimensions that are indispensable and closely interconnected. First of all, care is self-care, a concept also discussed by Michel Foucault. It is also the care of the other. Here, Puccini enters into dialogue with Emanuele Severino, but also considers responsibility towards institutions. Pulcini's thought is deeply connected to the institution, a philosophy of institutions. Why is that? Because through the institution, one reaches the third person that one does not see, the distant third person. It concerns those faces that do not appear but are present, those sufferings that do not come before our eyes. The institution is a crucial aspect of thought. Subsidiarity and social interaction. This is a significant point emphasizing that care extends to the environment, the earth system, and the Anthropocene, which should be regarded as fundamental extensions of human and civil rights. This argument aligns closely with the views of Pulcini, who are notably rigorous in their approach. Now, let's consider their method. Pulcini employs a phenomenology of the present and an ontology of current events, with a keen focus on identifying societal fractures and pathologies. They seek to trace the origins of these pathologies within the process of modernization. This approach is not far from Charles Taylor's concept of the discomfort of modernity. However, Pulcini's perspective offers an intriguing addition. She emphasizes not only diagnosis and critical analysis, which have been widely discussed both in Italy and internationally, but also a constructive element. Pulcini's ethical political proposal is crucial for addressing and overcoming these criticisms. The constructive part of Pulcini's proposal, the central theme throughout her work, is a rediscovery of the concept of passions. Pulcini emphasizes that passions are a crucial component of human subjectivity and are, in fact, the driving force behind communal action. It is well known that the rationalist philosophical tradition, including the Kantian and post Kantian traditions, such as post doctoral transcendental idealism, which traces from Descartes to Kant and Hegel, often relegates passions to the realm of the irrational or non philosophical. This tradition holds that passions must be subordinated to logos. In this view, logos holds primacy over all else. Consider René Descartes' famous work Les Passions de l'Homme or Spinoza's Ethics, which treat passions geometrically. Remo Bodei also explored this in his beautiful book on Spinoza, Geometry of Passions. Finally, consider Immanuel Kant, who in paragraph 16 of the Critique of Pure Reason states that the foundational element of knowledge is given by Ich denke, I think, the supreme logical principle. Kant regards the emotional, passionate world as empirical and accidental, a colorful self that philosophy should not take into account. A philosophy understood in the manner of Stefano Eigenschaft is a rigorous science, a science of the universal. Kant argues that while pragmatic anthropology can address this, it remains descriptive and cannot elevate itself to a transcendental universal perspective. In contrast, Pulcini seeks to elevate the theme of passions to a transcendental level, viewing them as a heuristic force. We will explore what she means by passion, as this is a topic of very careful scrutiny. Hegel himself exemplifies the rationalist suspicion of passions. In his early work, Glaube und Wissen, Faith and Knowledge, Hegel criticizes Jacobi and Schleiermacher for promoting what he considered a lesser philosophy based on feelings and emotions, dismissing passions as irrelevant to serious, rigorous philosophical inquiry. Pulcini, however, has made significant contributions even from a historiographical perspective. By valuing an alternative modernity to the more rigorous rationalism. This alternative modernity emphasizes an entire anthropology, a concept appreciated by thinkers like Franco Totaro and occasionally by the ecological philosopher Caltagirone. This anthropology encompasses the great themes of feelings, passions, and emotions, which drive action and form the foundation of social bonds. Pulcini also builds on what Benedetto Croce referred to as musology of humility, a concept I find beautifully expressed in a Franciscan context. Following Giambattista Vico, Puccini assigns fundamental speculative value to the theme of fantasy and imagination, which are nourished by passions and affections. Pulcini identifies imagination as the link between the theoretical and practical realms, developing a path from the freedom of imagination to the imagination of freedom, a kind of social imagination. Pulcini references a specific hermeneutic approach by Hannah Arendt to Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment. Arendt reads and interprets Kant in an original way, updating the Kantian text into one of aesthetics. She emphasizes the strong and often overlooked connection between aesthetics and politics, particularly the link between perceptual and imaginative abilities and the demands for social change and revolution. This revolution begins within individuals and then extends to society. Imagination is the precursor to action, serving as the antechamber of action. The mundus imaginaris has a normative political and ethical function, providing an experiential image of new worlds and new institutional possibilities aimed at caring for society, the world, and the biosphere. Addressing today's issues, particularly the environmental crisis, requires mobilizing our imagination, as emphasized by Puccini in an important text. Sociologists note that our young people often lack productive and constructive imagination. Therefore, an educational antidote, something Puccini passionately advocated for, is needed. This antidote should be incorporated into educational process to foster imagination in students. Mobilizing the imagination should not only be used to envision negative scenarios of catastrophe, as Gunther Anders suggests, but also to think positively, as proposed by authors like Hannah Arendt and Gianluca Nassi. These thinkers, whom Puccini engages with, advocate for imaging a form of the world that allows for responsible choices in the here and now. The concept of responsibility, de Verantwortung, is central to Elena Pulcini's philosophy. She emphasizes a thought and ethics of responsibility through the rediscovery of passions and emotions. For Pulcini, caring for the world means conserving life and ensuring the survival of the human species. But it also involves creating a meaningful world. This involves transforming what is currently a market totally governed by utilitarian logic into one of meaning. Rebuilding social ties is essential to this transformation. Authentic being is communal, or Mitsein, viewing the world as a plural set of singular being in constitutive relationships. This relational subjectivity is a key constructive aspect of Puccini's proposal. It is no coincidence that Puccini's analysis of social issues and the pathologies of modern and postmodern societies begin with the study of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, particularly the split between amour-passion, the conjugal love, one of Elena Pulcini's principal works on Rousseau, explores the origin of social conflict through this lens. The theme of passionate love is central to this discussion. One of Puccini's early texts on this topic precedes another interesting work that engages with authors from the Frankfurt School. Her first book, The Family at Dusk, was published in 1987 by Editori Riuniti, a publishing house then associated with the Communist Party and the secular left. Despite being a secular thinker, Pulcini engages deeply with Franciscanism, publishing some essays with the Messenger of Padua. She is a highly dialogical author, addressing the crisis of modern social bonds through the lens of family dissolution. For her, the family was a foundational principle, almost a seminarium rei publicae, quoting Cicero, though she is far from a traditionalist. Elena Pulcini, along with Marta Usman, advocates for the reconfiguration of family ties. Pulcini supports progressive concepts like rainbow families, highlighting a very forward-thinking aspect of her reflections. While she sees the family as central, she believes it must be rethought in new forms. In 2001, Pulcini published a significant book that began to systemize her reflections on the pathological drifts of modernity, sparkling considerable debate. This successful volume, translated into multiple languages, explores the modern individual's lack of passion, the rise of individualism, and the loss of social bonds. Pulcini argues that individualism, despite embodying the emancipatory project of modernity and ethical autonomy central to Kantian thought, has intrinsic pathological degenerations. The emancipative project of modernity includes elements that erode relational and communicative tissues, leading to a weakened community and a loss of social bonds. Pulcini advocates for a reconstructive ethic and community ethic, but without falling into communitarian or identitarian extremes like Machintal, who sometimes approaches community in a very identitarian way. Pulcini's vision of community avoids the excesses and ideologies associated with rigid boundaries. According to Pulcini, modern Homo economicus, as taught by Mandeville and Adam Smith, has reduced the social bond to a mere utilitarian tool. More recently, Homo technologicus, or postmodern Homo digitalis, has fragmented social ties by relegating them to the virtual sphere, resulting in what we might empirically observe as connected loneliness. Pulcini's most authentic and foundational philosophical gesture is to move beyond the dynamics of acquisitive passions and the individualism and characteristic of modern Homo economicus, liberal man, and contemporary neoliberalism. This critique aligns with Machestan's studies on modernity and modern economic liberalism, tracing its development from John Locke to Friedrich Hayek. Pulcini's approach calls for a deeper understanding and reconstruction of social bonds beyond the utilitarian and virtual reductions imposed by modern and postmodern economic paradigms. In the face of acquiring solitary and prophetic passions, we must rekindle our potential. This is our strength. The constructive and reconstructive nature of his position emphasizes the need to rejuvenate communal passions. Pulcini advocated for a paideia of passions, an education that fosters connections through our emotions. Take, for instance, the concept of philia. Here, we reflect on the classical views of Aristoteles, Thomas Aquinas, and Francis of Assisi. To overcome negative emotions such as envy or the desire to dominate others and the overpowering libido, what Pulcini terms the status naturae lapse, we must revive alternative passions. They are passions that stand in opposition to the dominant forces of modern atomistic individualism and regressive identity-driven communitarism. Pulcini argues for moving beyond both the narcissistic obsession with the self and the fixation on sectarian identity. These two extremes, unfortunately, persist in contemporary social and political practices in Italy, Europe, and globally. The obsession with the self on one side and sectarian identity on the other. To reclaim our relational and communal dimensions, Pulcini uniquely integrates three theoretical paradigms, which, despite their differences, share a fundamental anthropological insight: the transcendental location of Elena Pulcini. What is the essential anthropological fact? It is the vulnerability and fragility of the human condition, our mortality, as celebrated in the Canticle of the Creatures. Man is inherently a being in need of others. We exist with each other and for each other. Even from a biological perspective, we are incomplete beings. We are never self-sufficient. We always require others and the community. As Aristotle states in the first book of Politics, no man can live alone. He who does so is either a beast or a god. According to Pulcini, these three paradigms of authentic community life can be derived from three distinct sectors. First, subjectivity, as comprehensively analyzed by feminist thought, focuses on themes of social bonds and care, a fundamentally maternal perspective. Second, the gift paradigm, initially introduced by French anthropologist Marcel Mauss and later embraced by the convivialist movement which Pulcini supported. This movement continues to be active with publications and vibrant cultural initiatives. Lastly, there is a great paradigm of recognition, or anerkennung, as developed by Axel Honneth, drawing on the communicative and ideological reasoning of his mentor, Habermas. Pulcini also pays close attention to how the paradigm of interpersonal recognition has been adopted in France by authors close to her, such as Paul Ricoeur in his works Paths of Recognition. For Pulcini, these three paradigms are theoretical frameworks that, when combined, support a philosophy of caring for others and for the world. And I quote, "My proposal is that healing should first be a psychological and emotional response from a person who is aware of their own insufficiency. This sense of vulnerability, a person conscious of their own limitations, perpetually seeks otherness, à la rivière de l'autre, in search of the other." We now examine the constitutive and constructive elements that Pulcini has drawn from these three paradigms, integrated into a philosophy of communal and generative passions that create relational goods. This reflects a Franciscan aspect of Pulcini's thought. In 2003, Pulcini published an important collection of essays titled The Power to Unite: Woman, Desire, and Care. This outstanding collection engages with authors such as Carol Gilligan and Iragay and Nada Fusini and Judith Butler and the authors of the Idiot Center in Verona and possibly Les Belles Lettres. While some aspects of this paradigm may be open to criticism, it remains a valuable framework for discussion. Pulcini emphasizes that feminist thought offers a more comprehensive view of subjectivity, aiding in the restoration of social bonds that are often lost in modern and postmodern contexts. Despite the radical position of some feminist thinkers, such as Carla Lonzi in her essay written in 1970s, Spitting on Hegel, Pulcini distances herself from these more extreme aspects of feminism. However, she asserts that feminisms and women's thought must be reclaimed and integrated into a paradigm of care. This is crucial because it has helped to bridge many modern dichotomies, particularly that divide between reason and passion. Additionally, it addresses the distinction between the oikos and the polis, the public sphere, where the private sphere, typically associated with woman and the care of home and offspring, contrasts with the public sphere dominated by male rationality, utilitarianism, pragmatism, and entrepreneurship. According to Pulcini, 1946 was a watershed moment in Italy because women gained the right to vote and became fully integrated into the public sphere. This shift allowed for the universalization and normalization of the sphere of maternal care, which had traditionally been confined to the private domain. Pulcini's last book, published in 2020, entitled Between Care and Justice: Passions as a Social Resource, encapsulates this argument. She posits that the female approach, as well as the approach to social philosophy, encourages us to transcend the rigid dichotomy between private care and public justice. Care and justice are complementary elements that must be cultivated daily by everyone. In care, we find the emotional, passionate, and empathetic foundations, a theme closely related to empathy, that drives citizens to create just institutions. These institutions must be attentive to those who are distant in space, foreigners, the different, and those distant in time, future generations. Puccini argues that authentical global justice must encompass a maternal care for others and life itself, including nature and the biosphere. Elena Pulcini also engages in constructive dialogue with deep ecology. In one of our seminars, Professor Antonino Clemente delivered a clear and insightful report on deep ecology, referencing the Norwegian philosopher Arne Naess. Pulcini concurs that an ecological breakthrough is necessary. A new sensibility towards the care of nature is needed, beginning not only with institutions but also with the transformation of self. However, Pulcini's relational thinking is careful not to diminish the importance of personal identity, a theme also discussed in the context of deep ecology. These environmentalist perspectives often have a naturalistic underpinning, something influenced by Spinozism, which emphasizes a neutral, impersonal view of nature. Elena Pulcini warns that this perspective can be dangerous from a legal standpoint, as it equates human life with that of insects and plant species. While environmental thinking should be relational, it must never lose sight of human dignity. As Thomas Aquinas said, the human person is perfect in all nature because they are a responsible subject. Pulcini also acknowledges that great religious traditions can contribute to the dialogue. Buddhism and the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, share the concept of stewardship, where humanity is entrusted with the care of creation. This idea of creation as a trust or inheritance is a powerful and empowering aspect that underscores our responsibility towards nature. Pulcini engages with the second paradigm, that of relational anthropology, by embracing the concept of the gift. In archaic societies, the act of giving was a public event. Marcel Mauss, in his seminal 1925 essay on the gift, highlighted that giving, receiving, and reciprocating form the foundation of pre-utilitarian social bonds. For Pulcini and others, it is crucial to revive this vision of the gift as a part of a program to move beyond the friend-enemy dialect. The amicus hostis principle discussed by Carl Schmitt. The economy of giving fosters a new hope, where the enemy or outsider can become an ally, a socius. This idea also reflects the Franciscan aspects of Pulcini's thought, the cycle initiated by the gift. Give, receive, reciprocate. Thus becomes the cornerstone of peaceful relations between individuals and groups, and between different peoples. The gift inaugurates a timeless morality. It is a total phenomenon that encompasses not only the economic dimension, but also an anthropological aspect that shapes life itself in its entirety. Pulcini, aligned with the political sensibilities and ethics of the 2014 convivialist movement. The convivialist movement, initiated in the 1980s under the leadership of Alain Cayenne, has had significant influence. It was inspired by the work of Marcel Mauss and is known by the emblematic acronym MAUS, Mouvement anti-utilitariste dans les sciences sociales, which stands for the anti-utilitarian movement of the social sciences. Pulcini shared with Caillet and the philosophers of Mauss the commitment to critiquing utilitarianism and emphasizing the importance of non-mercantile relationships, principles of thought and actions in life. In this sense, they agree on the primacy of relational goods. What are these invaluable relational goods that form the essence, the most beautiful aspects of our lives? Friendship, fraternity, solidarity, and shared responsibility. These are fundamental to life, yet they exist beyond the reach of the market and any purely utilitarian logic. While this perspective may seem peaceful and irenic, it is in fact a clear opposition to the mainstream neoliberal mantra of less regulation, less tax, and less state. The convivialist movement reasserts the gift paradigm as a cornerstone of our societies. One of the main goals of the convivialist movement, which Pulcini also supports, is to reintegrate economics with ethics and other spheres of human life. The goal embodies the hope of resurgence of man as a donor, a homo convivialis, over the still dominant paradigm of neoliberal utilitarianism. As Francesco Stetti, a prominent author and historian, clearly stated, convivialism is a counter-movement to the total process of neoliberal globalization. It aims to revitalize and reactivate the cycle of giving, receiving, reciprocating. The lesson from Marcel Mauss's essay on the gift is not only epistemological but also ethical and political. It remains to be fully discovered and reinvented through critical thinking and sociological imagination. This aspect connects to the reflection of the convivialist movement of Stetti with those of Pulcini, the role of sociological imagination. Pulcini and the convivialist movement wish for the spirit of the gift to rejuvenate contemporary society, making relational goods the foundation of social practices. The gift economy represents the rediscovery of relational goods, based on cognitive empathy and community passions. According to Pulcini, relational goods involve essentially emotional dimensions such as trust, friendship, and solidarity. These goods transform relationships between people from mere instruments for satisfying self-interest into ends in themselves, serving as common goods. Relational goods can only be truly enjoyed when shared. This essential characteristic of reciprocity means that the relationship itself is a valuable good. Pulcini emphasizes that relational goods can only be appreciated in practice, both in our personal lives and within society. It is also insightful to consider a unique etymology from the Arabic language. Pulcini valued cultural dialogue and noted that in Arabic, the word for communal solidarity, sa'ada, shares its root with the word for happiness, sa'id. This semantic connection reflects the Quranic spirituality embedded in classical Arabic, suggesting that a genuinely happy life or human flourishing is achieved through ethical conviviality, mutual help, and the sharing of goods. In this vision, Puccini aligns closely with Edgar Morin, a thinker described as a planetary humanism. Morin, in one of his recent works, Fraternity, Why? Resisting the Cruelty of the World, in 2019, translated into Italian in 2020, observed, like Elena Pulcini, that fraternity cannot be mandated by a superior state authority, but must arise from within us. This is Pulcini's core message. What can we do here and now? What can we citizens rely on? The answer lies in the revival of relational passions. We must unite and strive for freedom and equality, even if it requires compromising between these ideals. We must also awaken fraternity, the third ideal of the French Revolution, which has not always been fully realized. Edgar Morin emphasizes that fraternity poses a challenge. It cannot be imposed from above or externally. It must originate from people in their specific, concrete situations. Its source is within us. The self, without the presence of others, atrophies in selfishness and sinks into solitude. The self also needs the other, the you, indicating a need for person to person affectionate relationships. These sources of feeling, collectively or individually, foster fraternity. We now come to the third paradigm, also embraced by Elena Puccini, the prerequisite of empathy and the generative passions of social ties in intersubjective recognition. For people to participate fully in society, they must have equal fundamental rights. Puccini refers to the young Hegel and Axel Honneth, emphasizing that social struggles for recognition are crucial. She also values the later work of Paul Ricoeur, who focused on political ethics. In one of his final works, Parcours de la Reconnaissance, Paul Ricoeur extends his theory of Homo capax to the relational dimension. He argues that human abilities include not only the capacity to speak, narrate, and attest to oneself and one's actions, but also the ability to recognize others and to be recognized by them. This capacity is fundamental, not incidental. Homo capax embodies the ability to acknowledge oneself as a person and to recognize others in their dignity, while also seeking recognition in return. This mutual recognition forms the foundation of the social bond. Only through mutual recognition do dignity and rights thrive, giving birth to a society grounded in justice and respect. Ricoeur highlights that the very development of I can, je peux, the ability to narrate, promise, and be accountable for one's actions, is sustained by mutual recognition. The French word reconnaissance encompasses both recognition and gratitude. Ricoeur suggests that the refusal to recognize others undermines democracy itself. Democracy is built on the recognition of individuals in their equality and rights, and when recognition is absent, democracy is weakened. Without recognition, Freedoms are restricted, leading to a silent, progressive erosion of democratic values, resulting in aphasia and discouragement among people. In contrast to recognition, disregard entails denying, disavowing, ignoring, and refusing to acknowledge others. This act of denial cuts off, closes down, and ultimately destroys the fabric of our civilization. Ricoeur's ideas were aptly discussed by Puccini. One of the most intriguing aspects that Puccini elaborates from Ricoeur is the ternary structure of personal ethos. According to Paul Ricoeur, self-esteem is founded on three forms of care: self-care, care for others, and care for institutions. However, Puccini argues that these must be complemented by a fourth form of care, made increasingly urgent by environmental issues: care for the world, or mundi, cura. When discussing the ecological crisis, Pulcini draws on the essential insights of Jonas, particularly his heuristic of fear. Pulcini's thoughts on fear are especially compelling. She asserts that fear has historically been a driving force behind social cohesion. This recalls Hobbes' justification for the birth of civil society, the pactum unionis, motivated by fear of violent death in the state of nature. Pulcini argues that we must reactivate the feeling of fear, but in a different form. Instead of fearing violent death at the hands of others, we should cultivate a more positive and constructive fear, fear for posterity and future generation. Pulcini emphasizes that this global fear should lead to proactive measures, going beyond defensive strategies such as denial in the face of nuclear threats or self-deception regarding global warming. An ethos of global responsibility can only be established from the bottom up, beginning with responsible citizenship. Central to this is the educational value of fostering generative passions. Now I will begin to draw some conclusions. Terms such as emotions, passions, moral feelings, empathy, and compassion are related but not entirely overlapping. Unlike Martha Nussbaum, with whom Puccini has many points of agreement, there is a significant divergence in their views. Puccini clearly distinguishes between emotions and passions. Emotions are temporary and arise from sudden, contingent events. They can be fleeting and intense in the moment, while passions, as Puccini emphasizes, are affective, intense, and lasting energies that permeate the whole self, eventually overwhelming it. Passions represent a metanoia, a transformative change of the self. Puccini would argue against not only the concept of political emotions, as successfully proposed by Nussbaum, but also political passions. Emotions are instantaneous, whereas passions are enduring and can be cultivated in a generative, constructive manner. This is why Puccini thoroughly theorizes the subject of passions. Only passions, she believes, have the capacity to truly affect the structure of the self and mobilize it on all levels, including the cognitive. Passions thus become the subject of critical analysis and a potential regulatory foundation, even if they represent a heretical norm. I would like to conclude with an exhortation. Puccini passed away on the 21st during the COVID-19 pandemic, but she left us with a message she wrote with Dr. Merenda in a small anthology, Vocabulary of the Pandemic Lexicon. Her final words were, "But now it's time to think of good." This optimistic message of hope reflects a critical analysis of the present. While Puccini does not shy away from critique, her outlook is not as bleak as Gunther's principle of hopelessness. In dialogue with Jonas, Pulcini's thoughts have their own unique aspects and peculiarities. I would like to end with her words. But now it's time to think about good. Thank you for your attention.